It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Warkentin to you this afternoon, pardon me. Chris was first elected in the House of Commons in the 2006 federal election and has been subsequently re-elected in 2008 and 2011. Prior to being elected in January 2006 as the MP for Peace River, Chris owned and operated a residential construction company. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Chris Warkentin.
Well, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's such a privilege for me to be here this afternoon. Now, Deb Gray said, don't get up there and say, I'm going to introduce a guy that needs no introduction. But in this room, so I'm not going to say that, Deb, but friends, in this room, we know Preston as a friend and as a mentor. He is truly a great Canadian. He's been transforming politics since long before he was elected to the House of Commons. Friends, it is a privilege for us to have Preston here and for him to continue to build into our lives. Now, when I look around this room, I see many of you who, prior to your introduction to Preston, were not political, were not engaged in your communities in the way that you are today. And it's because of the work that Preston has been engaged in through his entire career as his life's calling that you have become engaged in these endeavors in your own life. It is no different for me. I came from a non-political family. I came from a family that did pretty much nothing with regards to politics other than simply vote. But I recall when I was about 15 or 16 years old, sitting on the floor of our living room, and as the family waited in anticipation for the results of the 1993 election results. What had happened, of course, is that Preston had inspired people that had never thought about politics in their life before to become engaged. My family was no different. And I can tell you that from that moment on, I continued to foster a real keen interest in politics. I was privileged to meet Preston Manning a couple of years after that. Actually, it was a unique circumstance where Preston and Sandra had volunteered time to become involved in the Peace Country Pioneer Wilderness Camps. I'm convinced today, as I'm an elected official, that really it was Preston's opportunity to leave Ottawa and to escape the media in a place that nobody could find him. And so 5 days into a backpack trip, it was a pack horse trip, we would be sitting there around campfires and learning a little bit about who Preston was. Now, Preston was not political in this environment, but what was evident to me is that Preston was a person who believed in people, who was interested in people, and who wanted to make a contribution to people. And I think at that point, I truly understood that Preston was an average person who had an extraordinary desire to see things change in this country. And as a result of that relationship, and as a result of the passion and the person that I saw in Preston, I became involved increasingly in the political sphere. And ladies and gentlemen, like you in your ventures and in your journeys, you possibly wouldn't be here had it not been for this great Canadian, this person who has made the contribution that we all know well. I am a testament to the fact that I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have served my constituents over the last 8 years in the capacity that I have, had it not been for Preston Manning. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming many of our mentors, all of our friends, and truly a great Canadian, Mr. Preston Manning.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We're endeavoring to get this conference kind of beyond me, so these kind of introductions, I don't know if they help that, but thank you very much, Chris, for that kind introduction. And who would have supposed when I first met you up in the Peace River country and on that horse trip, this horse trip actually began at a place called Dead Horse Meadows, which was not a propitious beginning of our horse trip, but who would have guessed that you'd become interested in federal politics, your family, that you would have become one of the youngest presidents of an electoral district in the country, and that you would now be the representative of the great Peace River country from Alberta in the Parliament of Canada. Sandra and I are immensely proud of you, and we want to thank you for all the things that you've accomplished, and thank you very much for those kind words today. Thank you, Chris. And let me set the stage for our discussion by raising a couple of suppositions. Suppose our long-term goal, and I think it is good government for Canada, federal, provincial, and municipal, with good government defined as government in adherence to conservative values and principles. And suppose that to achieve that goal, conservative-oriented parties and politicians need to consistently win elections and then govern in accordance with conservative values and principles when they get there. What are the next steps towards those goals? What are the next steps for the economy, civil society, and democracy, as the speakers over the last 2 days have discussed? But in particular, what are the steps for the conservative movement, which is the subject of this session? And let me begin by drawing what I hope will be a helpful distinction between the role of the movement and the role of conservative political parties. Like most of you, I'm a believer in political parties, the concept of political parties and of conservative-oriented political parties in particular. And the concept of party is in somewhat disrepute these days, we know from our polling, but I would argue that if you abolished all the political parties today, they would be reinvented within 3 years, because majoritarian assemblies where you have to get, in our parliament, 155 people together to get something through. Eventually people vote together 5 times, 10 times, 25 times, 30 times, go for dinner together, and that's how you get political parties. That's how they began the old British system, and they'd be reinvented. But for those parties to be successful in the narrow sense of either winning more elections or, more importantly, in the sense of governing in accordance with their values when they get there, it's our contention that the parties need certain resources which increasingly need to be provided by those that are outside the formal party structure. In particular, they need a steady stream of ideas, policy proposals, and policy critiques, a stream that the conservative-oriented think tanks, academics, interest groups, constituents, consultative assemblies with Canadians, people sympathetic to the parties but outside of them can provide. The parties need an ever-growing and constantly replenished pool of trained people. The politics is a people business. And they need constituency executives, you know, campaign managers, campaign volunteers, staffers, candidates, prospective candidates, and much of the recruitment and training of which needs to be conducted year in, year out, in between elections, not just election years, by mentors and training organizations specifically dedicated to do so. And then thirdly, parties to be successful in the both sense that I've mentioned need supportive communications activity. They need magazines, journals, talk shows, public affairs programs, commentators, webcasters, bloggers, tweeters, to constantly develop and distribute conservative-oriented messages. And all of these other conservative instrumentalities, sympathetic to the parties and desirous of their success, but financed and delivered outside of them, constitute what we call the conservative movement. Now, the movement, another way of looking at it, is the extended conservative family which nurtures and supports its members. The parties run the family business, which is winning elections and governing. The movement has a broader, softer, relational side, which I think you've seen at this conference. It provides an honored place for the veterans of the political wars and a training base for the new recruits. It provides a place for conservative activists to rest and think and get recuperated in between elections. And it provides a place of shelter when the political storm clouds burst and the electoral tides are unkind, and a place from which to celebrate when the sun shines and conservatives live under the rainbow of political success. So what are some next steps for the movement that will strengthen it and in turn contribute to the health and success of Canada's conservative-oriented political parties? Now, some of you attended Dr. Turcotte's session yesterday, in which he presented our annual Manning Barometer, the National Public Opinion Survey. And what he showed you is that conservatism in Canada has suffered some setbacks over the last year since we did the previous survey. A slight decline in support for conservative ideology generally, a slight decline in support for the Conservative Party federally, particularly in British Columbia and in Ontario, and a decline in the perceived ability of Conservatives to deal with issues such as the environment, healthcare, and even the economy. With respect to the economy, the number one issue is still the number one issue in all parts of the country, expressed differently, sometimes jobs, taxes, incomes, ability to finance social programs, but at the base, economic concerns. Our surveys show that large numbers of Canadians want the very things that conservative economic policy offers them, particularly balanced budgets, lower taxes, and expanded trade. But decreasing rather than increasing numbers of Canadians identify conservative parties as the vehicles for pursuing these policies. And so this is important data, and there's no point trying to hide it. What we want to be dealing with here is with reality, not what we wish things would be, and these surveys are helpful in helping us face reality. So how should the Conservative movement respond to such polling numbers? We could ignore them or dispute them. We could fire the pollster. We've often tried that in the past. Andre's been through that. We could get discouraged and get down on ourselves and try to find someone to blame. Or we could frankly and honestly face up to these political realities and say to ourselves, what these numbers show is that there's work to be done. And that was always my approach. In the old Reform days, we never had a poll that showed us in a majority position, let alone a minority, plurality position. We always faced by the polls with an uphill fight. But the question it raised, okay, if those are the polling numbers, what has to be done to improve our position and to strengthen it? So what are the next steps for the Conservative movement, which include building on our strengths and addressing some perceived weaknesses? So what might rebuilding on our strengths look like, which is economic policy? The movement, through its research and communications work, can more specifically and effectively target 4 big constituencies. And I'm not talking here about our electoral districts. I'm talking about bigger constituencies than that. The 4 main groups of Canadians who likely want and benefit from the 4 main planks of conservative economic policy, as reflected in the federal government's recent throne speeches and budgets. These groups are investors whose confidence needs to be strengthened and won by steady progress toward eliminating the deficit. That's a whole constituency that we ought to get more than the majority in. The taxpayers whose confidence needs to be strengthened and won by holding the line on taxes. Workers whose confidence needs to be strengthened and won by investor-driven private sector job creation and increasing investments in workplace training, which is what Jason Kenney was talking about the first day. And consumers whose confidence is needed to be strengthened and whose confidence can be won by tax policies which leave more dollars in their pockets after an economic recovery, and competition and trade policies which increase consumer choice. By focusing on strengthening the relationship between Conservatives and these constituencies, we not only help to ensure that the economy is firing on all 4 cylinders, and this is not rocket science. The economy to fire on all 4 cylinders needs investor confidence, taxpayer confidence, worker confidence, consumer confidence. This not only helps in that area, but I believe would help strengthen the connection with the Reform Party, or between the Conservative Party and Freudian slip. Now, sometimes good polling numbers are not always a blessing and can be a liability, because they can lead to complacency and often confirm you in going in the wrong direction. And while we're rebuilding on our strengths, substantive policy and action on the economy, let us continue to hope that the Liberals, maybe buoyed by these polling numbers, will continue on their present path, believing that you can substitute charisma for substance, particularly on the issue of the economy. Now, personally, I have never been afflicted with charisma. In fact, Tom here used to refer to it as reverse charisma that I had. And charisma does have its place, particularly if the intention is to capture attention and to entertain. And this is especially true with the visual media, who have inherently favored charisma over substance. But when it comes to the economic concerns of Canadians, let us vigorously make the case that you can't eat charisma. You can't wear charisma. You can't pay the mortgage with charisma. You can't put charisma in the bank. And who would have the nerve to go to someone who's been waiting 5 or 6 months on a waiting line for health care and say the answer to your problem is charisma? Let me give you a dose of charisma. Or who would go to an Aboriginal family in rural Canada who's living in poverty and circumstances that most of us in this room can hardly comprehend and say the answer to your problem is charisma on the part of a politician? And while we're distinguishing between charisma and substance, I think we also need to distinguish between fluff and substance. And in this audience, there's a fair number of students. Some of you are in journalism and some of you in communications programs. A useful exercise for you would be to go and get the video of Justin Trudeau's speech in Montreal last weekend and compare it, particularly the discussion on the middle class, with the talk given by Brad Wall here a day ago, where he also touched on the middle class. Justin's talk was basically fluff. All the generalities about the middle class that have been said 1,000 times. Talking about the middle class is a default position in Canadian politics, because Canadians like the middle. Why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle? You know, why does hockey have 3 periods instead of 4 quarters? Because we wanted a middle period. Well, that's true. Psychologists have studied this. In the first period, we're apprehensive because the game has just started. We don't know how it'll turn out. Third period, we're sad because it's going to come to an end. But the glorious middle, focusing on. But what did Brad Wall say about the middle? He made a point. And he had substance. He says the middle class that Canadians ought to be interested in is the 500 million people in the middle class in Indonesia and China and India. And if we supplied only food and energy to that middle class, it would raise the incomes of our middle class, upper class, and lower class more than anything else we could do by talking fluff about our middle class. Let's contrast fluff with substance, and let's kind of communicate the message that charisma is no substitute for substance. Now, but I got to hurry on. Whereas the Conservative movement can be of significant help to the parties by identifying and leveraging our strengths, I think it can also be helpful by identifying and honestly addressing weaknesses and potential weaknesses. And this is something that's very difficult for the parties themselves to do, but less so for the movement, because we don't speak for the parties. They're free to ignore or disagree or agree with our findings and suggestions. And if and when, however, it comes to a choice between telling Conservatives what we want to hear and what we need to hear, I suggest it's easier here to say what we need to hear than it is at a party convention where you're going to be hammered if you talk anything about that you may have some problems to deal with. Now, to illustrate this role, 2 weeks from now, the Broadbent Institute, which is trying to become the left-wing equivalent of the Manning Centre, will be holding a major conference in Toronto. But I wonder how frank they will be in sharing some of the polling data that came out of the defeat of the NDP in British Columbia in the last election, or respecting their federal leaders' vulnerabilities in Quebec. In BC, as you'll recall, the NDP appeared to be leading by a substantial margin in most of the polls right up to the last week of the provincial election. But once BC electors got face-to-face with the possibility of an NDP government, they came to the same conclusion as electors in Ontario and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia have come to, that if it's the economy you're most worried about, and your economy is frail and languishing, the last thing you want to do is elect an NDP government, because managing the economy is not their competence or their strength. That's a reality. I'll be curious to see how much discussion it gets 2 weeks from tonight. And in Quebec, we did a poll which asked, among other things, what attracted Quebecers to the late Jack Layton in the last federal election. 43% of respondents said it because it was a positive, likable person. Another 27% said it was because they were fed up with the Bloc and the other parties. But most significantly, less than 7% said they were attracted to Layton and the NDP because they liked their policies or their ideas or the ideology. And when these same respondents were asked if Mr. Mulcair possessed the same characteristics that attracted them to Mr. Layton, 48% said no. Now, identifying and addressing these negative realities is the NDP's problem, and I would offer my consulting services, but I don't think that they would accept them. But what about perceived deficiencies and weaknesses on the conservative side of the spectrum that the movement has an obligation to acknowledge and address? Well, let me deal briefly with 3 of them. And the first one is the environment. While Conservatives are generally seen to be competent on the economy, that's where our strengths are, we continue to be seen as defensive and weak on the environment. In our Quebec poll, for example, perceived weakness on the environment was given as the #1 policy reason for not supporting Conservative political parties federally or provincially. Now, this is exasperating because it shouldn't be so. And I've talked here before, and I'm not going to labor this again, about the necessity of developing a green conservatism that's as robust as the old blue conservatism, red conservatism. You've heard me on this before. But this perceived weakness on the environmental front needs to be more seriously addressed. Jim Prentice was on this theme yesterday. He had some interesting suggestions that way. We have some in our own material. And I believe that the appointment of Leona Agluka as Canada's Environmental Minister is a positive and welcome step in this direction because she represents the Arctic. She comes from the Arctic. She's had an interest and commitment into environmental conservation. The Arctic is probably the last place where we're going to have a chance to get the balance between environment and resource development right. And I'm optimistic. But I think this continually being defensive about the environment, categorizing it as a shield issue where we can't win on it, the other guys occupy the high ground, is dangerous. It's politically dangerous. It's a deficiency, it's a weakness on the Conservative side, and it needs to be addressed. And you younger people, I think you understand this better than some of us older people. Our focus has always been on the economic and the fiscal side. Some of you have a better balance in your head. It's possible to be a fiscal conservative and live within your means fiscally. It's possible to be environmentally conscious and live within your means ecologically. And you have a contribution to make to help the remedying this perceived weakness. And then there's the whole field of municipal politics and governance. As most of you know, there's 308 elected federal officials, soon to be 338. There's 760 elected provincial and territorial officials, but there are over 25,000, well over 25,000 elected municipal officials in our country. And despite the fact that some of these municipal governments are bigger than the provincial governments, despite the fact that on many issues they have a more direct, immediate impact on citizens' lives than federal or provincial politicians, and despite the fact that local politics is often the training ground for many who go into provincial and federal politics, there are relatively few think tanks, support groups, or training programs, particularly on the Conservative side of the spectrum, dedicated to the municipal field. Left-wing think tanks and interest groups, including the public service unions, are becoming increasingly active at this level, and Conservatives need to become so as well, while respecting the desire of most municipal electors to keep the traditional parties and party politics out of the municipal arena. Thus, municipal politics is more a task for the movement than the federal or provincial parties. And this subject was thoroughly discussed yesterday at the session addressed by Dimitri Pantasopoulos and Jeremy Farkas. It's an area in which the Manning Centre itself intends to do more work in the future. And municipal politics and governance is an arena in which conservative-oriented thinkers and activists in all parts of the country need to become more engaged going forward. And then there's the democracy front, where perceived weaknesses on the part of Conservatives are most worrisome for me personally and call for, I think, immediate and serious attention. According to our most recent national public opinion poll, 62% of respondents feel that Canada could do a much better job in making our democratic institutions more responsive to voters, and in ensuring that candidates for political office are better trained and better prepared for their jobs. 65% feel that Canada, which includes the political parties, could do a better job in getting citizens more directly involved in the public policy process and improving voter turnout. And over 90% of Canadians, these are big numbers. Like if these numbers came in on some other issue, we would have a task force or something doing something about it. These are huge numbers. Public opinion that's 45, 50%, in some areas enough to draw your attention. You get up to 65, 75, 90%. 90% of Canadians support strengthening the powers of elected officials to investigate electoral wrongdoing, requiring full disclosure of how election funds are spent, and making party leaders more accountable to their respective caucuses. Now, as I say, these are challenges on the Democratic front for all the parties, but they should be a particular concern for Conservatives who believe in democracy and who want to strengthen their support among those Canadians who are conservatively inclined, but who are first and foremost Democrats. And you will run into a lot of these, and these are not being bound too tightly as they should be to Conservative parties. So 3 immediate things that can be done to strengthen conservatism on the Democratic front, and where I think the movement should be proactive and supportive. Number 1, continue to push and support the government's Senate Reform Bill, Bill C-7, eloquently championed by Secretary of State Poilievre at the session this morning. Democratic accountability to electors being the real answer to dealing with senatorial misconduct and ineffectiveness. Democracy's a good answer to one of the major perceived problems with the Senate. Number 2, since we're no longer in a minority government situation here in Ottawa, where governments could fall because 2 or 3 members went offside, loosen the grip of leaders and House officers on individual MPs, giving serious consideration to the intent and the principles, if not the details, of Michael Chong's House of Commons Reform Bill. And 3, amend the Fair Elections Act, or Bill C-23, currently before the House, hopefully with all-party consent, to strengthen and expand rather than weaken the role of Elections Canada with respect to addressing the greatest challenge to the Canadian electoral system, which is not its unfairness, although you've got to always be worried about. The greatest challenge to our electoral system is the steady decline in voter turnout in elections. Let's strengthen our capacity to address that. It was Alexis de Tocqueville in his famous Democracy in Alberta, Democracy. I'm having consistent Freudian slips here, Tom. In his famous Democracy in America, who observed that political parties, or factions as de Tocqueville called them, could be divided into 2 great categories: those which sought to limit the authority of the people and those which sought to expand it. And in my view, conservative governments, conservative opposition parties, the conservative movement needs to constantly affirm and reaffirm our commitment to extending rather than limiting a democratic expression. Now, finally, if there's one function that the conservative movement could perform on behalf of the parties and those who seek elected office, if there was only one function we could perform, I suggest it should be the promotion and delivery of training for Canadians in general and Conservatives in particular, to more effectively participate in Canada's democratic processes. In other words, the movement, we should make our major mission to strengthen the knowledge, the skills, the ethical foundations, the communications and leadership capacities of our political participants, executives, campaign managers, political staff, nominated contestants, and candidates for elected office. And some of you have heard me say it before, but I say it again: to become a barista at Starbucks, you got to take 20 to 30 hours training, but you can become a lawmaker in our parliament, our legislatures, our municipal councils with 1 hour of training in lawmaking. Is that a wise position to be in? Cicero, the great Roman senator, wrote in his diary, if you want to enter the forum, the great political arena of his day, intrate parati, enter prepared. And he took 10 years to prepare himself to ever enter the Senate. But to how many of our lawmakers or candidates or campaign managers have we provided the encouragement, the opportunity, the mentors, the materials, the resources to devote even 10 hours to prepare themselves for their position, let alone 10 months or 10 years? So 2 suggestions for strengthening the human resources of our democratic institutions, and particularly conservative-oriented political parties. First suggestion, devote some small percentage of the operating budgets of our Parliament, legislatures, and municipal councils to the provision of ongoing training and upgrading for their members and their staffs. There is a university student, Jim Billington, who's been helping us at our centre in Calgary. And I said to Jim, suppose we think of our democratic institutions, just the 14 senior legislatures, and the elections offices that support the elections of members to those institutions. Suppose we thought of just those institutions as a service business. And asked Jim, how big a democratic service company would that be in terms of revenues and expenditures? So Jim figured it out and gave me a paper the other day. It says it's at least a $1.7 billion company. We spend about $1.2 billion a year on just operating those 14 institutions. And we spend another $500 million on the election offices on the last 14 elections that sent the people to those institutions. So it's at least a $1.7 billion service organization. Actually, it's a lot bigger than that if you added in the cost of the municipal councils and the cost of municipal elections. Well, yesterday morning, Andrew Dawson of the Canada Building Trades Council told us that their unions alone operate a network of training centers across the country valued at $650 million, in which they invest $250 million a year in training their people. But when it comes to expenditures on training the members and staffs of our democratic service industry business, we spend virtually nothing. More money was spent per year on training and upgrading the knowledge and skills of the plumbers, electricians, welders, construction workers that worked on the outside of that building on the hill there, and they're still working forever on that one on the West Block. More money was spent on the training of those people than were ever spent on training and helping upgrade the knowledge and skills of the occupants of those buildings. And I just say that is not in the national interest, it is not in the public interest, and it is not in the interest of conservative political parties. So how about it? If our parliaments, legislatures, municipal councils, recognizing that in reality their democratic service organizations took even 3% of their budgets and dedicated to providing training opportunities and skill upgrading for their occupants and their staffs, maybe start with some basic things like lawmaking. No, I know people that got over there and they never discovered making laws was part of the business till they're sitting in their desk there and somebody put this big pile of paper on their desk. Parties don't talk about lawmaking as being part of the function, and yet that's something that only members of these elected assemblies can do. What about maybe starting with constituency representation, upgrading the capacity to serve constituents? Many members of legislative parties have never operated a small office, never actually managed a staff like that, not dealt with lobbyists and interest groups, training in that area. Or maybe in-depth interpretation of government financial statements and budgets. Anybody ever look at the estimates that come through that parliament and try to make head nor tail out of them unless you had some kind of orientation to it? We're not being critical of the folks that we send. What can we do to help them perform better? And I think if you perform better, you're going to have a better relationship with your electorate. You're going to inspire more confidence in the democratic process, and I think you can do better politically. A second suggestion, and then to further the training of people or participation in the partisan arena of federal politics, and to make it more financeable, how about one simple amendment to Bill C-23, the Fair Elections Act, which Secretary of State Poilievre is responsible for. And the purpose of this amendment would be to make it crystal clear that any training for political participation by any party, electoral district association, nominated or prospective candidate, or third party will not be considered an election expense or contribution in kind under the Act. Now, the lawyers say at the present they don't think it should be, but it's a gray enough area that a number of EDAs are hesitant to start getting into training. Is what if it gets rolled into their election expenses and applied against the cap? Why not make it crystal clear, they're amending the Elections Act anyway, crystal clear that these investments in preparing people for political office, particularly prior to the writ period, will not be considered as either an election expense or a contribution in kind. Have limits on campaign spending by candidates and parties? Agreed. Have limits on who can donate and how much they can donate to political parties and campaigns? Agreed. But no limits outside the writ period as to what can be invested in or spent on education and training of people willing to participate actively in the democratic politics of their country. Now, to conclude, back in the days when I was engaged in political door knocking in Calgary Southwest, which is now Stevens riding, I was always thinking about better ways to get citizens more engaged in elections. I mean, door knocking can be a pretty boring activity. So I used to try to think of something different to say at every door, or every sixth door, not the same thing 10,000 times. And I was thinking about this one time. I knocked on this one house, and the fella, when he found out what I was doing, he just asked very bluntly, "What's your platform?" To which I replied, "What's yours?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, my party and I have a platform which I can show you. But what about your platform? What is it that you want to achieve over the next 4 years? For yourself, for your family, for your community? You have a job, you're in a business or a business sector, for your country." I say, write that down. And you judge me as your MP and my party, particularly if we were ever to form a government, by the extent to which our policies and actions facilitate and enable you to implement your platform and achieve your goals. What's your platform? This is a modest vision of government. It's not a vision of government that comes to you with 49 things that we're going to do. It says, what is it that you want to do? And how can we facilitate and enable that role? It's a conservative vision of government. Government is a facilitator and enabler as others. And likewise, the conservative movement is a facilitator and enabler. We're a facilitator and enabler of conservative thinkers and political activists to better serve their parties, their constituents, and their country. That Canadian Tire commercial that they've been running is true, that says there is no such thing as an unassisted goal. Sid Crosby's game-winning, gold-winning goal in the 2010 Olympics was assisted by Calgary's Jerome McGinley. Marie-Philippe Poulin's game-winning, gold-winning goal at the 2014 Olympics was assisted by Hamilton's Laura Fortino. And in the democratic political game, there is no such thing as an unassisted election victory. There is no such thing as a successfully unassisted implemented public policy. There's no such thing as an unassisted political career. And no one's more conscious of this than myself. Whatever I've been able to accomplish politically has always and in every instance been facilitated and enabled by others, many of whom are in this room. And so in recognition of this role of the movement and movement people, the role of the movement is fundamentally a facilitator and enabler of political action and success by others. We want to end this session by inaugurating an award for service to democracy to be given each year to someone who exemplifies the role of the movement in enabling and facilitating political achievement by others. And we've decided to name it after a man whose contributions in this role are enormous, well-known, and appreciated by all of you. He's been chairman of almost everything to do with deconstructing and rebuilding the conservative movement in Canada, including for years chairing this conference, and his name is Cliff Friars. So we're going to conclude this session on next steps for the conservative movement by asking Cliff, accompanied by Blair Nixon, the chairman of our foundation, and Chuck Strahl, the chairman of our center, to come on stage to receive the first annual Cliff Friars Award for Service to Democracy, an award which he not only richly deserves, but has earned by years and years of toil, often in the shadows, so that others might succeed and bask in the limelight of that success. We're going to give Cliff the last word of this session on next steps for the conservative movement, so please join me in welcoming and congratulating Cliff Friars.
Ladies and gentlemen, Conservatives all, and there's probably a few actually seeking shelter on a cold day in the capital who've snuck in, so welcome to you all. Thank you, Preston, for those words, and thank you to the Manning Centre, represented by Chuck and Blair, for both awarding me the award and creating the award in my name going forward. Enabling and facilitating. You know, such an award in my name is kind of odd. It seems to me a very odd thing. As many of you know, my persona is actually that of a tough, arrogant kind of guy. As much fewer of you know, those tools, of course, were always used, I hope, in furtherance of our conservative objectives. Now, what is enabling and facilitating really all about? Well, it is about, in a word, servanthood. So before I get to discuss that for a few minutes, I'd like to point out that in the audience today is my wife, Leslie, and my daughter, Kaylee. My son, Gare, and his wife, Kate, could not be here today. And as many of you know, the loving of Leslie has grounded me as none other thing in my life. And those of you who know her know of her influence upon me, so thank you to Leslie. Interestingly, we all know what politicians do, but those of us who have volunteered in the background for many years, going from Calgary to Halifax for a weekend of political bickering would not seem to be family-friendly. But I never heard a complaint, and one of my greatest achievements is the realization of my daughter's growing fascination with our black arts. I would like to talk to you, though, of three things, the first of which is servanthood, the second of which is heroes, and the last is friendship. I have been blessed to pursue my political involvement through that incredible example of servanthood, Preston Manning, a man of humility, intelligence, and vision, but always in the service of others, for them and not for him. I will not pretend that I am of his ilk. I am not. I believe this award, facilitating and enabling, will always be more in his concept of servanthood than anything I could achieve. Recently, the greatest man of my time passed away, Nelson Mandela, who I was privileged to see. His example of service to others, to a nation born, represents a beacon to whom we all must move. But that heroship is something that I would like to pass on to the younger conservatives and folks in this room. You need to establish heroes, create heroes whose perception in your mind will be your barometer going forward. I often ask myself what my greatest hero, Lincoln, would do. His greatness always takes me out of my own pettiness to be a better character. Churchill and Thatcher, who we all adore in this movement, were also great examples of heroes for me. I did not, in my lifetime, to great regret, ever see Margaret Thatcher in person. I regret that. If you have such heroes, you can consult same in your mind on a regular basis, and you will be a better enabler and facilitator for it. Now let me speak of friendship. And in the political arena, oddly enough, because of the advancement of American history that's taking place before us, and thank you to HBO and David McCullough, we are aware of one of the greatest political friendships in history, that being the one between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. These two were key figures in the founders of our great brother nation to the south, but they were also at the time there at the emergence and actually were in the opposite groups that created the two political forces and founding parties of the United States. We tend to forget all this because when we read the story of their lives, we find out that their friendship was supreme to almost all other things. but political friends they were. I am blessed with friendships born of great Canadian battles I was lucky enough to be part of. The respect, trust, and support of the group of us who waged war together knows no bounds and created a bond that cannot be broken. There are people in this room who have become my greatest friends in life. To those of you who are younger, I would say to you, look 2 rows up and 3 seats to the right, and you will find someone there who could well end up, after 25 years, your greatest friend in life. It's a hell of an experience. As much as politics is about power and change, please recognize that friendship grows from that. That will make you a stronger and better servant, and I assure you that political success with a friend is greater than simply political success for a cause. So keep that in mind. Today, in fact, those friendships are the most paramount part of my political life, and those of you in this room know that. As I speak, one of my dearest friends is in trouble. Our group knows that. All I can say is those friendships and that bond is fantastic. Remember this as you pursue your servanthood. All politics is human. While ideology and principle leads us, human relationships hold us together. I end by simply saying 2 things. I am honored to be perceived as a servant. I am blessed to have family and friends who have made that journey worthwhile. I hope I can continue to be an example. Thank you.
Oh, you do it.